Hey, 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 guess who's back? Yes, you guessed it. It's Brandon Hart of Data Ninja with part 2A of web scraping NFL.com for stats. In part 1, I demoed a Python script where we actually went to NFL.com and scraped a bunch of stats. And then I promised that in the next episode we would go through line by line in the code and I would give a detailed explanation. However, in order to fully understand what that code is doing, there's a few foundational concepts that we must grasp. So in this episode, we'll take a look at number one, when and when not to web scrape. Number two, understanding the web application architecture. And then number three, a basic understanding of HTTP requests. Before we get into all of that, I used that script and pulled down 2019 rushing stats and did a few visualizations in Power BI. So let's go to Power BI and have a little bit of fun with the data. Okay, this is the my Power BI visualization. If you don't have Power BI, I highly recommend it. One reason is because it is free, and just to get Power BI desktop, okay, and you can play with data, make visualizations on your desktop. You may notice that I have the Pro trial. There is a trial, I think it's a 60-day trial available. I have 53 days left, so haven't decided or not if I'm going to keep the Pro trial. One of the things it does is lets me publish my visualizations to the Power BI service, and then I can share this, for instance, with you guys. You can get this same report, download it, get all of the data. So it's pretty cool, but haven't decided if I'm going to get the Pro version of that. That of course kind of depends on a lot of things, and some of which might be the amount of video likes that I get, the amount of subscribers that I get, hint hint. But anyway, let's look at this visualization and have a little bit of fun here, because this is the end game, right? Just looking at the data, the top 10 NFL rushers, you can see that Derrick Henry is killing it. I mean, when you look at this first, yards and average by player, has two axes, and number one is the total amount of yards. Then you look over here on the right, you got your yards per carry, right? So we can kind of see this is pretty cool. There's your top rushers tend to have the most yards per carry until you get over here to Josh Jacobs. He perhaps didn't have the amount of attempts. Had he had more attempts, he probably would have had more yardage. That's the thought there. But right now, I mean, you can't lose with a Derrick Henry or a Nick Chubb or Christian McCaffrey. Oh, and one thing to mention, this is just purely rushing yards. This is not all purpose. We could go to NFL.com and pull down all purpose yards. But looking at this, I mean, it's clear to see who this is your top 10, and then who's the cream de la creme of that top 10. You know, one thing that I like to look at is this chart down here is a 100% chart. So all their attempts, how many of them were under 20 yards, how many were between 20 and 39, and how many were over 40 yards. Now, if you look at it, I put the percentages there. The vast majority, over 90% of their carries are under 20 yards, right? So I really had to rescale this thing so that you can kind of see who are some of the runners that are getting some of the larger runs, you know, the 20 to 39 and the 40 and aboves, right? And as you can see, I mean, Ezekiel Elliott, he doesn't have a lot of those, but once you start getting to the Derrick Henrys, the Nick Chubbs, the Marlon Macks, they're popping off some really large runs. Coming over here to this other bar chart, we're comparing your first downs, your touchdowns, and your fumbles. You know, it's pretty interesting. I mean, first downs, as long as you're getting your first downs, you're doing your job, right? So Ezekiel Elliott is killing it in that. He's got 12 touchdowns. It's pretty good. But when you look at Derrick Henry, 16 touchdowns rushing. I mean, he's doing it. You look at Christian McCaffrey, this is just rushing once again. 15 touchdowns, only one fumble. So you can kind of see, you know, who's doing well. One kind of thing to realize is I filtered this on only running backs. Let's see what happens when we just look at top 10 rushers out of all positions that they have here. And one cool thing that jumped out at me was look at Lamar Jackson. My goodness. I mean, almost 7 yards a carry. And out of top 10 rushers overall, I mean, he's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Look, 5% is over 20 yards. I mean, that's just phenomenal. So one reason I wanted to show you that visualization is because of this quote right here. Information is the oil of the 21st century, and analytics is the combustion engine. All right, that was by Peter Sondergaard. Excuse me if I pronounce that incorrectly, but basically, you know, the part we did, the end game, as I said before, is the analytics, right? It's the combustion engine. It's getting that insight. And so another term for that is called data mining. It doesn't sound like we mine data in that step, but data mining, you got to read it as mining for insights. And that's kind of like what we did with that Power BI visualization. And the first part before we can actually mine is we actually have to get the oil. So to get the oil, we have to do a little bit of data engineering, which is kind of getting that data and prepping that data. So in order to get the data, we are going to use a web scraper. But let's talk about why we would web scrape, right? So one thing is, before we even start, let's ask ourselves, do we have a direct connection to the data? In this case, NFL.com, so that's out of the question, right? So then, is there an API available? That's another thing. So one thing, you might be asking yourself, what is API? Well, basically, the host, so in this case it would be NFL.com, they might design an interface in their application that will allow us to access their data, or might allow us to post things to their database, or allow us to execute functions, and we can do all that from outside of their application, right? We can just build our own application that can do all of those things with that interface. So that's an API. So if they have an API, it will require a user account, and it also give you documentation, so you don't have to worry. It will tell you exactly how to use that API. So to find out if they have API or not, usually I go to their webpage and you can search for API, or to be honest, I do this more often than others. I search for developers, because usually web pages have a for developers section, and then it will let you know the different ways that you can interface with their data if possible. Now, I didn't find that on NFL.com. So the other thing is file transfer. So that's kind of like, once again, you'd have to contact them. Hey, can you push a file to my folder every day, or whatever the interval that you might have. And obviously, we don't have that capability in this scenario. So let's go ahead and web scrape. Alright, so the next two segments of this episode has the potential to be a little dry, but let me frame it like this, okay? Have you ever wondered what happens when you go to a website, right? So if I was to go to NFL.com and hit enter, what is transpiring, right? This you might call a website, but it's really more than a website. It is a web application. There is logic in the background happening that's serving up this web page, and we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about the web application architecture. And then the way we get this information, what the browser is doing to send this information, that's called the HTTP request. So we'll have to understand that for a couple of reasons. Number one, to web scrape, and then number two, you need a basic understanding of that if you're going to use any web-based APIs. Alright, so web app architecture. Let's think about that question that I proposed earlier. What happens when you go to a website like NFL.com? You type in NFL.com and hit enter. Well, what happens is that browser then writes up a text file called an HTTP request, okay? That request gets sent through the internet, and then it's going to go to the web server that NFL.com is registered to. Once it gets here, something called a web app runs, which is basically just logic. It might be in C#.net, it might be in Ruby on Rails, but whatever the case is, this web app is going to take that HTTP request, and based on what that HTTP request has in it, it's going to do something, right? In our case, when we go to NFL.com and then we actually say, okay, take me to the stats page and give me the rushing yards and give me page number 1, it's actually going to go to then to this their database, and let's assume it's a SQL database, and they're going to run the query to bring back those rushing stats for page 1. This web app is then going to write those stats to a text file, and then it's going to mark it up in HTML. It's also may add in some scripts that run on your browser side, okay, to give some additional functionality to the web page. It may write in some cascading style sheets, which are information that also shows how the information should be displayed. Okay, and then it's going to send it back through the internet and then back to the browser. Then your browser finally is going to read that text file. It's going to get the data, and then it's going to display it in the way that the CSS file told it to, the way the HTML markup told it to, with the information that is in that text file. So this is important to understand, because like when we don't have direct access to the SQL database, like we can't go to the SQL server with credentials and run queries directly from it, or there's no API available, or they're not going to send us a flat file with information that we want, then we are left with trying to use this method to send a proper request that eventually is going to get to this database and bring us back the information we want. And then at that point, we're going to look at that text file, and what we want to do is go run through that text file, or parse through and pull back just the information that we want. That's what we're doing when we're web scraping.
Okay, so finally, HTTP base, excuse me. So when we make that request, this is what the HTTP request looks like. This is a sample right here, and this is a good document to have here, because when we web scrape, we're going to, in our Python code, we're going to import a request library. It's kind of good to look here and see request line, request header, what a body is, because all that will be modeled out in that library. There's different type of requests. This is a GET request, meaning let's get some data. We're just going to send that to the server. The server's going to read through all this and give us back some data. Down on the bottom in the body, we see we're passing some parameters, but there's another way to pass the parameters, which we're going to talk about next, which is basically through something called the query string. Okay, so looking at this example down here in the blue, I went ahead and I went to NFL.com, then I clicked on the stats, and then I actually clicked on the button that said passing, and it generated this in the web browser. And basically everything after this question mark is called the query string. So the question mark begins the query string, and then it's in key value pairs. And in this particular part, tab sequence is the value of 0. Okay, and means, or the ampersand is the next key value pair or the next parameter that we're interested in. Statistic category equals passing. Okay, so
some of this is self-explanatory, such as season equals 2019. So we know what that means. Some of it is a little more ambiguous, like this D-447263-S equals passing _ yards. Okay, so we may be able to assume that, okay, this is the type of stat that we're looking for. So okay, we're good there. But let's look at the next one. This D-447263-O equals 2. What the? So this one is where you might want to play around with. So you say, what happens if I say equals 1? And then you put that in your browser and you hit it and you see what happens, and then you can kind of understand what that parameter controls.
But one thing about the query string is it can't have any symbols, and so those symbols have to be encoded in ASCII. So this point number 5 kind of explains how that is generated. So then finally you send that request over to the server, and the server's reading all this, and it's like, okay, let me give you what you want, and then it's going to send back a response. Okay, so the response is a text file too. It's going to have all this information. Then it's going to have the body. In the case of where we're asking for a HTML file, that HTML document will be in the body right here. So you see H1, my home page. That is HTML right there. So let's go ahead and let's see if I can get out of here. And this is going to be a good segue, because we're finished up with this part of this multi-part segment. But as a segue, let's go ahead and look at some of the HTML that's generated from this. So this is the I just copied this query string that we were just looking at, and this is what it brought back. But how do we parse through this? So let's look at the HTML. And you can do that in Chrome. Right click and hit view page source. Okay, so this is pulling back the source. And I mean, you see a bunch of, to me, we can just call it like gobbledygook. It's really big. And and once again, this is an example of how it is written by a machine. So, I mean, it would take like a human forever to write this. And in the real world, the human writes the code that writes this. So it's kind of interesting. So what we're going to do, and what we want to do for this assignment is we're actually going to parse through this. So 99.9% of all this garbage we're not even going to look at, and we know specifically that we're looking for a table of information, and so we're going to go line by line through this text file and look for where the table starts and pull the information from there, and we're going to use that and put it into our data frame and save it onto our computer in a format to where we can do some analysis. So please stay tuned for the next episode, and also if you found this useful so far, informational, please go ahead and like and subscribe and tell your friends about it. And until then, we'll see you next time.